So, today's video is dealing with contestable market theory. Before we start talking about contestable market theory though, I want to take us back and understand the historical context behind it, because it will help to shape your thinking about this particular topic. Prior to the theory coming out, what regulators, economists, and government used to do is that they would look at the concentration ratio in a market. And the more concentrated the market, the more they would argue that it needed to be regulated because there's only a handful of firms dominating that industry, so we need to make sure that they're not being anti-competitive. Contestable market theory came along and said, actually, it's not a question of how many firms are in the industry. That isn't that important. What is more important is the threat of entry. How realistic is it that other firms can now enter that market? So for example, let's say that there is only 3 firms in a particular industry, but suddenly the threat of entry becomes real, where there's a genuine chance that another firm could enter that market. Would those firms want that firm to enter? Of course not. So what are the kind of things that they're going to start doing? 1, they might start reducing their price. 2, they might start to make their customers happier. They'll improve their customer services. In other words, they start to behave as if there is more competition, even though there isn't. So contestability is to do with how realistic the threat of entry is. How easy or difficult is it for firms to be able to enter this market? The definition of a contestable market is simply this. A contestable market is one in which there are low barriers to entry and exit and low sunk costs. Now there's a brilliant case study of how a market can become more contestable over time, or how very clever people can identify gaps in order to make a market more contestable. The example I always want you to remember is EasyJet. EasyJet and Ryanair, but particularly EasyJet. Let's look at what EasyJet did, because prior to their entry into the airline industry, it was dominated by a few big firms. But they came in and did the following. So based on our definition of the fact that the barriers to entry are low, number 1, have you noticed that EasyJet flights never take off or land at Heathrow Airport? How comes? Because it's far more expensive for them to land and have landing slots at Heathrow. So they're always taking off from places like Luton, Gatwick, Stansted. You know when you go on an EasyJet flight and you land at like Madrid, you're not really in Madrid, you're like Luton, Madrid equivalent, and you have to take a coach to like the actual Madrid. So that's number 1, their costs are much lower because of that. Number 2, you want food on an EasyJet flight? You need to pay for your food. It ain't gonna come as part of the package. That also reduces their costs. You want baggage? That's not part of the deal either. You need to pay for your baggage. In fact, Ryanair at one point tried to charge people for using the bathroom on the plane. The European courts of law basically said that it was a violation of human rights, so they weren't able to do that. But that's an example of how they're trying to reduce the barriers to entry for themselves by cutting their costs. Now, one of the most interesting things about the EasyJet example is that they spotted a gap in the market. A gap in the market is where you enter the market and say, look, I'm not selling the exact same thing that everyone else is. It's similar, but mine is unique because of this. So in the example of EasyJet, they were like, well, look, we're not providing a high quality service where you're going to love the flight. But what we're going to do is this. You're going to get from A to B. Yes, we're going to pack you like sardines, but you're going to get there for like 10 quid. Are you in? And people were like, yes, we're in. That is an example of a gap in the market, whereby you don't need to compete directly with the existing firms that are in the industry because you're trying to present yourself as like an alternative. Now, these are often a little bit harder to spot, by the way, in the data response. In the June 2011 paper, I believe, it had a question about Nescafé and how Nescafé were the dominant market player in the instant coffee market. There was one line in the data response which was the gap in the market. It said, there is growing awareness amongst consumers about ethical trading and about healthy lifestyle. Well, if I wanted to enter that market, I wouldn't enter going, hey, I'm instant coffee just like Nescafé, I'm trying to compete with them. No, I would go, look, my instant coffee is healthy. It's really good for you. That would be an example of a gap in the market. Let's think about the car industry. What was the gap in the market if we went back to sort of the mid-1990s? Or even the early 2000s. The gap in the market was electric cars, because you were entering the market going, look, I'm not trying to compete with Mercedes, Audi, Volkswagen. I have a different type of car completely. Now after that, by the way, there was another gap in the market, and a very intelligent man called Elon Musk entered the market with Tesla. Think about what Tesla is. Tesla were like, okay, so there are electric cars, But are there sporty electric cars? Are there cool looking electric cars? Not really. So that was the gap in the market. They entered it not by trying to compete directly with the existing companies, but by providing something completely new. Now, what we're going to do is simply this. We're going to go through factors that would suggest the market is contestable and factors that suggest that it is not contestable. So that whenever you get a question in your exam about whether it's contestable or not, you literally just need to look at the data and contextualize it around these. In other words, I'm pretty much giving you the answer. You're welcome. Number one, the first factor that would suggest that a market is contestable is if there is evidence of entry into the market. If you see that firms are entering the market, that would probably suggest that the barriers to entry have fallen. So therefore, the market has become more contestable. A cool word that they like to throw in often is fragmented. The market has become more fragmented. In other words, there are more players in that industry because others have entered the market. One. Number two, in terms of what would make a market more contestable is if there is a gap in that market. So like we've just described, a gap in the market could be that you enter but present yourself as an alternative to what's already there. So let's say in the chocolate market, the gap in the market could have been organic chocolate or healthy chocolate or whatever it might be. Try and see if you can identify a gap in the market from your data response. Number three, the third reason why a market may be contestable is if incumbent firms, incumbent by the way just means existing firms in the industry, receive reputational damage. Think about why. Because if they receive reputational damage, what is happening to their brand loyalty? Well, their brand loyalty is starting to waver a little bit. It's not as strong as it was before. So that represents an opportunity for you, the new firm, to enter the market, and thus it becomes more contestable. Good examples of that in real life: Tesco, horse meat scandal. That wasn't great. Another example could be Samsung with their exploding phones. Another example could be Volkswagen lying about their carbon emissions. All of these are examples of reputational damage. And reputational damage means that there's an opportunity for someone to now enter and take advantage of that. Number four, another thing that would suggest the market is contestable is if incumbent firms are being inefficient. Because if incumbent firms are being inefficient, then you can now enter the market, be more efficient than they are, and compete with them on a cost basis. There's an entry route for you to enter into that market. So those are the factors that suggest that the market is contestable. Of course, there's more than that, by the way, but that's a pretty decent list, and you can kind of get your head around that and know that there are others similar to that. Now, what are the factors that suggest the market is not contestable? Before we say number one, word of caution. The most common error, if you ever read some of the examiner reports, which I highly recommend, by the way, you'll always notice that at least one candidate always says this. They go, oh, the market is highly concentrated, therefore it is not contestable. No, no, and no again. The contestability of a market has nothing to do with how concentrated the market is. I couldn't care less. It could be one firm and it could still be contestable. So never ever say that. Number one on our list is simply this. If the incumbent firms, the existing firms, have strong brand loyalty. And you can tell that by the name. So if you recognize the name, that probably suggests that it's got strong brand loyalty. So like Kellogg's and Coca-Cola and Pepsi and companies like that. If they have strong brand loyalty, that means it's extremely difficult for someone to enter the market. A good example of that is the phone market. Think of the two dominant players in the phone market, iPhone or Apple and Samsung. If you try to present yourself as an alternative to them, how likely is it that you're going to get people to switch away from iPhones to buying your product? Probably not that high. It's quite tough. So therefore, the market is not contestable. Number one. Number two. In order for us to explain number two, we need to go through a theoretical concept. And that theoretical concept is called minimum efficient scale. Minimum efficient scale is just a fancy way of saying the bottom of the AC curve. So if we draw an AC curve and we look at it, we can now talk about how easy or difficult it is to reach that point. So let's compare two industries. In fact, this was a past paper question. They were comparing hairdressing to supermarkets. And they were talking about whether the economies of scale are higher and easier to achieve in supermarkets or easier to achieve in a hairdresser. Well, if we draw the two AC curves side by side, see if you can figure out which one represents hairdressing and which one represents a supermarket. The first represents a supermarket. And the logic behind it is this. In order to reach the MES, there are significantly more economies of scale that you can tap into compared to a hairdresser. You would need, therefore, way more capital, way more money to be able to get anywhere near the bottom of your AC curve. Now, how many firms do you reckon have the money required to be able to tap into the economies of scale in that industry? Hardly any. That is why you only have a handful of supermarkets. Similarly, think about the car industry. Well, in the car industry, how many firms have the capacity to be able to bulk buy in the same quantity as Audi? Think about when Audi buys something like steel. How many units do you reckon they bulk buy? Probably in the billions. Therefore, if you try to enter that market, you would need to be able to bulk buy in the similar quantities. In order for you to do that, you need a lot of money. You need a lot of capital. And if that's the case, the market is not contestable. If you require massive amounts of capital to reach the MES, then this is not an industry that is contestable. Contrast that with hairdressing. We can probably set up a hairdresser pretty quickly. The costs involved are pretty low. You need, like, I don't know, you can even do it in your house. A chair, scissors, mirror, good to go, right? There isn't that much in the way of bulk buying that you could do that would be justifiable. You wouldn't bulk buy 1 million bottles of shampoo. That just doesn't make sense. It's just inefficient at that point. Whereas you would do that if you're Tesco, because you've got multiple stores, you've got a massive warehouse, and you know that the stock will go quite quickly. So that's number two. If reaching the MES requires significant capital, then very few firms will be able to enter that market, so the market is not contestable. Number three is a really easy one. If there is evidence in the data that this existing firm or any of the existing firms are advertising, because advertising, as we know, is a sunk cost. If you're advertising, let's say Tesco, it is extremely difficult for anyone else to enter that market because they won't have the budget that you have. They won't be able to advertise with the same volume and sort of the production team, and it won't be as effective an advert. Therefore, they're likely to have really strong brand loyalty on the back of that. Any form of advertising represents a sunk cost, so the market is not contestable. Number four, as a backup. Number four is to talk about if incumbent firms are actually being really efficient. So if you look at the June 2012 paper, 10C. 10C in June 2012 is talking about whether the US car market is contestable. Great question. One of the points is, it says how Toyota had to recall, can't remember the exact number, but about 4 million vehicles. The next sentence straight after that, though, says that it would be foolish to underestimate them because they have the most efficient system in place. Therefore, their costs are likely to be very low. It is extremely difficult for you to compete with a firm that is really technologically capable, a firm that has really low costs because they're so good at what they do. Therefore, the market would not be contestable if the existing firms are already being efficient. As a backup generic evaluation, it's a direct actual evaluation of number one. Number one of our analysis was to talk about, hey, look, there's evidence of entry. Other firms are entering. The evaluation is to question who they are. Who's entering? Because if it's a bunch of nobodies that no one's heard of, then fair enough. That's a contestable market. But if, for example, let's say Richard Branson decided tomorrow that he wanted to enter the car industry and he wanted to set up, I don't know, Virgin Cars. Well, him entering the market doesn't really mean that it's contestable. It's more the fact that he has the capital required to get in despite the barriers to entry being high. So you can question who's entering the market as a way of evaluating. In the question about Nescafe, it was talking about how two companies were entering the instant coffee market. Number one was Starbucks with Via, and number two was McDonald's with McCafe. So your analysis would be like, oh look, there's evidence of entry, the market's contestable. But the evaluation is, yeah, but it's Starbucks and McDonald's. They're very recognized, they're huge brands, and they have a lot of money behind them. It doesn't really mean that it's contestable, it just means that they are capable of entering the market despite the barriers to being really, really high. Hope you enjoyed that video. Check out some of our other stuff and please subscribe to our channel.
Thank you for watching. Why not subscribe to our platform to see other videos like this one? You can also register to attend intensive revision courses, book a private tutor, and utilize our in-house revision resources to help you achieve top grades. Good luck.